This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hello, hello. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. Starting off, Ruben from Mexico says, it's reported that eating uncooked Lanmaoa asiatica, a mushroom, causes a very specific hallucination. One sees tiny people, Lilliputian hallucinations, I think it's called. As far as I've researched, there's no explanation as to why, but the correlation between eating the mushrooms and the hallucinations are well documented.
They are indeed well documented. Lanmaoa asiatica is a type of mushroom. It is a mushroom that belongs to the Boletaceae family, and it grows mostly in this one province in China, Yunnan province. It's mostly down there near the borders of Myanmar, Laos, Vietnam. So you go to marketplaces in Yunnan, and they're selling this mushroom. And what is known is if you undercook it, intentionally or otherwise, you see little people. Just as a note, I'm going to make a lot of reference to these little people and these Lilliputian hallucinations, and actually to little hominins in the next answer. And this is being used in a very different sense than the contemporary sociocultural version of little people as being a term used among the community of individuals with dwarfism, but this makes no reference to that. This is being used in a completely different sense. Okay, you see little people, hundreds of cases each year of people coming into the Yunnan hospitals who have eaten this mushroom in an undercooked state, and they're hallucinating. And 97% of the time, what they're hallucinating is little people on your tabletop, little people swimming in your bowl of mushroom soup, little people waving hello, little people jovial, little people threatening. This seems to be something consistent enough. This was an account by somebody studying this, a botanist, University of Utah mycologist, who had gone to Yunnan and said, among other things, you go to restaurants there and you order soup that includes this mushroom, and they deliver the soup to you, and they put a timer on the table and they set it at 15 minutes. And they say, with this soup, if you want to see little people, eat it in less than 15 minutes. If you don't want to see little people, wait until more than 15 minutes. Totally bizarre, totally strange. And then there's 4th century manuscripts, Taoist manuscripts from there saying, this mushroom, you see little people. Then you go up into the mountains, very remote area in the Philippines, where the mushroom also grows. And there's a word in their language for the little people that you see. This is totally wild. So scientists have tackled this to some extent. At this stage, nobody knows what the hallucinogenic compound is in this mushroom. All the usual suspects have been tested for, and nothing has been isolated. And there's a biochemistry lab, University of Utah, that's trying to isolate the compound, the molecule that's responsible for this. So this is for real. And as you heard in the question, what is being produced here is what are called Lilliputian hallucinations. Lilliputians, those were the little people in Gulliver's Travel. Lilliputian hallucinations, you see little people. And that happens in a number of domains. A very cool review on this in 2021 in a journal I particularly like called Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews, looking at the entire story of Lilliputian hallucinations. Turns out they were named by a French psychiatrist in 1909 named Raoul Leroy, who not only studied it, but he said he had Lilliputian hallucinations. And I found one description of him, which I thought was so charming. He was painted a portrait. He was a big deal in French psychiatry then. So somebody painted his portrait and afterward wrote describing him. He's very clever, he's very gentle, and he's very elegant with his blasphemy, which I thought was a wonderful description. Okay, so he's the first one who describes it. Nobody knows why he was seeing little people, but He started off the labeling of this Lilliputian hallucinations. Now, what are Lilliputian hallucinations not? You get people who are withdrawing from alcohol dependency and they see little people, but they also see zoopsia. They see animals, little animals. They see phantasmic creatures that don't actually exist. They see bugs all over them. This is not what you see from this mushroom. Furthermore, there are no known brain tumors that cause this particular hallucination. No versions of schizophrenia where this is in the literature. Now, what else? There's this neurological disease called Charles Bonnet syndrome, where you get damage in one part of the retina. So you have a large blind spot and it's too big for you to just fill it and to gestalt it. So you wind up having a blind spot in your visual field. And people with this syndrome report hallucinations in their blind spots. Not very exciting ones, hallucinations of colors, of patterns, geometric patterns, occasionally figures, but not at all like this. Now, those of you who are among our most faithful followers will be reminded this sounds a little bit like Alice in Wonderland syndrome, where you go down the rabbit hole, and this is another neurological, neuropsychiatric disorder where people see things being smaller than they're supposed to be, micropsia. Huh, that kind of sounds like this. Have we just stumbled into another version? Does this mushroom induce Alice in Wonderland syndrome? No, some critical differences. First off, in this Alice in Wonderland thing, you get micropsia. Some things are smaller than they should be. Macropsia. Other things are bigger than they should be. Then you feel your body as being smaller or bigger than it should be. Time is moving slower or faster. It's a whole different realm. And the other thing about it is it's objects in the world around you that are looking very small or very big. You're not seeing the waiter there in the restaurant looking very small and swimming around in your soup. You're hallucinating these figures. It's different from Alice in Wonderland syndrome. So, some hints as to where the action of this mushroom is occurring, this area that's kind of a juncture between what's called the temporal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe that carries visual information. And it's there that you do this fancy higher level integration of multisensory inputs and this phenomenon called size constancy. At one point, you learn you look at a person and they walk a long distance away, and you look at them now and they're smaller. We learn it's not because they got little. You learn at a distance they appear smaller. There's a size constancy that you correct for by distance. This is the part of the brain that does that. And it seems to be the part of the brain where you're most likely to get Alice in Wonderland syndrome in terms of brain imaging studies, neuroimaging. We covered that, tumors in that part of the area. At present, the best guess is something screwy is going on across the intersection and the integration of these three lobes in the brain. So at this point, nobody knows what the compound is in this mushroom. Nobody knows why it makes you hallucinate. Nobody knows why it makes you hallucinate little things, let alone little people. Final interesting thing about it, every now and again, you get someone who is a total crab and they get their hallucinations from this mushroom and they find it irksome. Turns out the majority of those 97% of people who wind up in hospitals in Yunnan province each year with one of these mushroom hallucinations, they either find it perfectly benign, tolerable, or a subset enjoy it. So this is this whole bizarre world. And at some point, biochemical mycologists are going to figure out what the deal is with this. But this is this weird mushroom where people see little people hallucinate little ones. It's for real.
All right, now from an unknown sender in an unknown location is the straightforward question, Hobbits?
Hobbits? How could anybody not want to deal with a question like that. Hobbits, One Direction, Tolkien, Hobbits, Lord of the Rings, but a different kind of hobbits is what we're going to focus on as we go down in an Alice in Wonderland like rabbit hole of looking at the other type of hobbits. Hobbits, the alternative ones, a different type of human who went extinct not all that long ago. Different types of humans. We've got Neanderthals, which were relatives we could interbreed with and all over Europe. And in the last few years, people have learned about these people called the Denisovans, who were contemporaries of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. They mostly lived in Asia. And it turns out there's a third hominin species that was alive at the same time as us, living on this tiny island in eastern Indonesia called Flores. This tiny island where in 2003, some paleontologists, team a mixture of Indonesian and Australian scientists, were digging in a cave there and they found a skeleton like no one has ever seen before. This skeleton, remarkably complete, almost complete skull, was of some sort of hominin, some humanoid thing. And it had roughly the same proportions as Homo sapiens do, but it was little. It was tiny. It was about 3.5 feet tall. And it had a much smaller brain case, producing a brain about the third of the size of a Homo sapiens brain, more in the range that you see in a chimp. So they're short, they're tiny. They are, on the average, about a foot shorter than the shortest human indigenous populations. In other words, not only do we have little people swimming around in your soup, there was this little people kind of hominin that was living somewhere not that long ago on this island. And they had tools and they knew how to make fire and they were able to butcher animals and they were going about some fairly sophisticated stuff. In the years since that one initial skeleton almost complete, which turns out to be a 30-year-old female, which of course is called Flo, coming from the island of Flores. Since then, there's been something like 15 skeletons that have been found in various degrees of preservation. And they're all these little people things. And the paleontologists there began to start referring to these as hobbits. And sufficiently so that at least one time, one of the discoverers of it was giving a lecture somewhere and got a cease and desist order from the Tolkien estate saying, you're not allowed to call them hobbits because we don't like it for some reason. At my end, if anyone has read this great science fiction book, H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, they strike me as looking like Eloys, these little future humanoid things. But in any case, they got called hobbits. And immediately you had one of these mud fights that you get in paleontology all the time, which is, are we looking at a new species of hominin? Are we looking at something different from us and Neanderthals and Denisovans? And a major fight broke out at this point because paleontology, you find like the fingertip bone of something that looks different from it's a new species. And in the case of Denisovans, it turned out a single finger joint was the first example of bone since then that was a new species. People immediately fighting. And the old guard did something that they always do when there's a possibility that a new species, a hominin species, has been discovered, which is for them to say, no, it's not a new species. It's some sort of screwed up human who died back when. For example, Neanderthals, when the first skeletons were being found, all the old guard was saying, this is not a new species. This was like some husky, arthritic boy with a unibrow or whatever. They were just sort of like deformed human. And we eventually figured out Neanderthals are not just deformed humans. So the first resistance to hobbits being a new human species came from old guard paleontologists who said, no, this is just some sort of pathological human. What are they suffering from? Well, they got the small bodies, but whoa, those tiny brain cases, they're microcephalic. Flo, the very first hobbit discovered, Flo had microcephaly, which means a tiny brain. And the trouble with that interpretation was twofold. First off, microcephaly, a rare neurological disorder in humans, does not produce brains that are this tiny. The other problem is all 15 of the skeletons found that had skull remains are tiny also. Yeah, right. This happened to be a colony of like microcephalic Homo sapiens. That couldn't be. The next version that came up was, well, this is another version of abnormal human brain. And the term that was applied by some of the old guard was these brains were lissencephalic. You look at the surface of the human brain and it's got sulci and gyri and convolutions. A lissencephalic brain is one that's smooth on the surface. And somehow they said, yeah, these are just humans suffering from some lissencephalic disorder that messed up all sorts of other stuff. But then came the first studies using CT scans of some of these hobbit skulls where you could see what the inside of the brain case was like. And there were ridges and convolutions. They were just like Homo sapien brains. They had the same surface complexity or something close to it that we have, and proportionately, their frontal cortexes were as special and big as in Homo sapiens. Whoa, that's totally amazing. So there goes it's this disease or it's that disease. Then the rear guard came up with this thing called Laron syndrome, which is a neurological disorder. It's very rare, congenital. And not only do you get a little body, you get a little brain, and you tend to find it very rarely in certain inbred populations. Same problem again. These hobbit brains were way smaller than you ever see in people with this syndrome. Then there's this rare, weird congenital iodine deficiency disorder that produces small bodies and small brains. And it turns out you see it in some inbred populations in Polynesia and Indonesia and Malaysia. Ooh, are we looking? Are we seeing descendants of them? Is this another version of screwed up disease, pathological Homo sapiens? And the same deal again. The brain shrinkage you see in this iodine deficiency isn't even close to what you see in these hobbits. And there's been all of these. It's not a new type of hominin. It's a screwed up human. Each one of those have been swatted down, whack-a-mole. And most of the field has come around to saying this is indeed a new hominin species, as new and as closely related to us Homo sapiens, but a different species, as Neanderthals and Denisovans. And what people started calling them was Homo floresiensis, the humanoid species on the island of Flores. Nobody has been able to extract DNA out of the bones yet, but when they do, that's going to be totally amazing. Now, as is often the case with these paleontology stories, there's some tragic subplot in there involving a villainous character. At some point, one of the paleontologists working on the project who was saying, this is a human, this is a human, this is just some sort of screwed up human, got so upset at the emerging evidence that this was not the case that the guy took all of the hobbit bones and put them back in his house in the garage, or I don't know, but he took all the bones and hid them from the rest of the community. And this went on for about 3 or 4 years until he was finally persuaded to return the bones. And who knows what the hell he was doing with them, but a bunch of these priceless, irreplaceable bones were damaged when they were in this guy's possession. This reminds me of one other example of this: Easter Island in the Pacific. isolated population there, Melanesian, Polynesian, whatever it is. And the first European missionaries showed up there, I don't know how many centuries ago, and the people living there had a written language on tablets. And what did the damn missionaries do? They said, oh, this is satanic stuff. And they burned all of the written evidence of their culture. There's only one or two of the tablets that survived that are in somebody's private collection. And nobody knows what this language was. And this whole culture's written history was destroyed by missionaries. Okay, so this guy messes up these bones, the missionaries ones. These have been the tragedies in there. Now, here comes another tragedy with the Hobbit story. And I don't know how many people will view this as tragic, but I do. This was heartbreaking to me. The first estimates of the age of the Hobbit bones was they were as recent as 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years ago, humans were inventing religions. They had had languages for a long time. Humans were doing agriculture. They had domesticated animals. They were living in permanent settlements. They were making composite tools. They were teaching tricks to their domesticated dogs and chickens and cows. 12,000 years ago, Homo sapiens are getting at this level in the Neolithic era. And somewhere out there on this little island, there was another type of hominin still living. I could not believe how wonderful this was. Like, if I could time travel, all I would want to do is go back and study these hobbits and how they interacted with humans. And turned out it was a dating mistake. Actually, the hobbit bones, their time period is from about 190,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago, before humans were doing agriculture or domestic. So we never had a point where somewhere on this planet were modern humans teaching their dogs silly tricks while there was this other hominin species out there. Instead, 190,000 years ago to about 50,000 years ago. So what happened 50,000 years ago? That's around the time that Homo sapiens reached the islands of Indonesia and settled there. A coincidence? I am not sure, but that's when these hobbits disappeared from the island of Flores. Since then, another cave on the island about 50 miles away has been excavated, and an ancestor of the hobbits, Homo floresiensis, has been dug up there, a somewhat less modern version of it, and it's 700,000 years old. Those things have been on that island for a long time, and most people in the field say this is a descendant of another hominin that lived in Asia like 1 million years ago or so, Homo erectus. This seems to have been this little population that wound up there. So, of course, what we want to know about this little population is, why were they little people? Why were they so little? And what we get into here is this whole field of evolution, population ecology, something called island biogeography. For really complicated reasons, species that live on islands tend to get way bigger than average or way smaller than average. They tend to show either insular living on an island, insular gigantism, or dwarfism. And people, ever since this term was defined some decades back, have been trying to figure out what are the rules when you get giant species on some islands and tiny little ones on some other islands. And this is a whole world of research, and it's got something to do with the size of the island and the size of the original species when it first got there, and the ecosystem there, and the density, and all sorts of other variables. And people are still working this out. Wonderful book by the naturalist, natural history writer David Quammen, called The Song of the Dodo, about island biogeography, which embedded in there has a 3-page passage on what the final day of life was like for the final dodo on Earth. And it is devastating to read. So we've got island biogeography, and you see on islands all over the world, you get species of fairly weird sizes. They tend to be a lot bigger than the mainland species they descended from after they somehow swam to the island, or they wind up being a lot smaller. Bigger ones, examples of insular gigantism. On Flores, at the time that the hobbits were running around there were giant storks that were twice their size. Lots of big birds popping up on islands. You got those giant dodo birds and the giant kiwis and the giant moas, all of which are extinct. There was a giant pigeon on Fiji that went extinct, although that may still exist in Central Park in New York. So these gigantic birds. In addition, a whole lot of these islands have insular gigantism of rodent species, giant rats. There's a giant rat that lives on Flores, which is about the size of a bunny rabbit. And there are extinct giant rats on the island of Sicily, Sardinia, Majorca, a bunch of. So that's a pattern that you see also. Another rodent version, there's an island off the British Isles called St. Kilda. It's way out in the outer Hebrides, and its history of human habitation there is so bizarre and so interesting. And among other things, there was a gigantic St. Kilda mouse there, extinct. There's gigantism on islands of spiders and crabs, and the biggest ones, the biggest sticked insects on Earth, are found on a Polynesian island. And just take a look at it here, and you will be creeped out. On Caribbean islands, you have gigantism among the geckos and the skinks there. On St. Helena in the Atlantic, you have the St. Helena gigantic earworm, which is some insect thing which doesn't actually get in your ears, but that was always the legend. But they're like 3 inches big, and they're extinct. And maybe they're extinct because nobody had ears they could fit into. So all these versions of insular gigantism. And of course, you got Galapagos tortoises. And you've got a lemur, an extinct lemur in Madagascar that was the size of a gorilla and was 330 pounds. So, for the array of reasons people are still beginning to figure out, there's a lot of cases where species get really big once they get to an island. And note, if your explanation for it was they were already big when they swam to this island from some other island, you have not explained the mystery at all. So we've got insular gigantism. Then we've got insular dwarfism, and all sorts of tiny little species, when compared to their cousins on the mainlands, they wind up being tiny on islands. There have been dwarf elephants all over Asian and European islands going back when extinct. They were like 3 feet tall, tiny little adorable 3-foot pygmy elephants. Another example of it, there were non-mammoth mammoths. There were pygmy mammoths on this one island north of Siberia called Wrangel Island. All the mammoths in Siberia were mammoth in size, and the ones who somehow wound up on this island, they underwent dwarfism. They were about 1/6 the size of the regular old mammoths. Another version, here's the version which will knock your socks off. Komodo dragons. Komodo dragons, they're the biggest lizards on Earth. They're found on the island of Komodo, which is right next door to Flores. And they're also found on Flores, and they were there around the time of the Hobbits. Komodo dragons are gigantic. They're 10 feet long. They weigh 300 pounds. They're incredibly dangerous, and they eat people, and they eat cows, and they eat bison. Oh, this sure sounds like we've got a case of insular gigantism. There used to be some little monitor lizard thing that got to these islands and got really big. No. Komodo dragons are a case of insular dwarfism. Their ancestral form, which lived in Australia, was about 25 feet long and weighed close to a ton. And it's only when those things somehow wound up on these islands in East Indonesia that they underwent the shrinkage. So think about that tonight. A Komodo dragon is a pygmy version of a species that used to be living in those parts. And thus we come to our final example of presumed insular dwarfism, the Hobbits. Homo floresiensis, they seemingly migrated, descendants of Homo erectus 700,000 years ago or so, and got to these islands. Who knows how many islands they populated before going extinct? They've only been found on this one island. They may be scattered all over Polynesia and Malaysian islands and such, but at least some of them got to this island, and over the subsequent 3/4 of a million years, they got a whole lot littler. And all I can conclude is they were reasonably terrified of Komodo dragons and them and the little miniature elephants. They would ride the elephants to find little hiding places to get away from the dragons. There was another kind of hominid out there, and whoa, are they interesting? And people are learning more and more about these folks.
And that's it. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.